The stars had always been silent, and humanity had always looked up at them with wonder and curiosity, and a quiet hope that maybe one day they would find someone else out there in the endless dark of space. They found someone, or rather someone found them. It was a Tuesday morning when the first ships appeared above Earth, and they came not in ones or twos but in thousands, and the sky turned black with the hulls of warships so massive that they blocked out the sun over entire continents, and people stood in the streets looking up with their mouths open, and their phones raised, and for a few brief minutes there was excitement, and awe because this was first contact, and this was the moment humanity had dreamed about for centuries. But there were no greetings, and there were no messages of peace, and there was no invitation to join some great galactic community. There was only fire. The first strikes hit New York and Shanghai and London and Mumbai and Tokyo and Sao Paulo, and the beams that came down from those ships were not like anything human science had ever imagined, and they cut through buildings like a hot blade through paper. And where they touched the ground, the earth itself turned to glass, and the shockwaves flattened everything within 100 kilometers. And in those first terrible minutes, millions of people simply ceased to exist. The ships belonged to the Vethari hegemony, which was a coalition of 12 alien species that had ruled the Orion arm of the galaxy for over 40,000 years. And they had a law that they called the culling principle. And the law was simple and brutal. And it said that any species that reached a certain level of technology without first submitting to the hegemony had to be destroyed before it could become a threat. Humanity had never even known the hegemony existed, and they had never been given a chance to submit or to negotiate or to even say hello. And the Vethari had simply looked at the humans and their little colonies on Mars and Titan and Europa, and they had decided that this species was growing too fast and too wild, and needed to be burned back to nothing. The bombardment lasted 72 hours. 72 hours of continuous orbital strikes that turned forests into deserts and rivers into steam and cities into craters. And the ocean boiled along the coastlines, and ash filled the atmosphere and blocked out the sun. And it was like the end of the world, because for most of the people on Earth it was exactly that. 4.2 billion human beings died in those 3 days. Children died in their schools, and parents died reaching for their families, and soldiers died at their posts, trying to fire weapons that could not even reach the ships in orbit, and doctors died in hospitals that collapsed around them, and farmers died in fields that caught fire from horizon to horizon. And it was not a war, because a war requires two sides that can fight, and this was just a slaughter. On Mars, the colonists watched through telescopes and satellite feeds as their homeworld burned, and there was screaming and crying, and people dropping to their knees, and some of them just went silent and stared at the screens with empty eyes, because what do you do when you watch your entire world die from 55 million kilometers away? On Titan and Europa, and in the asteroid stations scattered through the belt, the story was the same, and people gathered around screens and watched the feeds until the feeds went dark one by one, as transmitters on Earth were destroyed. And the last message anyone received from Earth was a broken distress call from a submarine deep in the Pacific that simply said, "They are killing everyone, and we cannot stop them." And then silence. The Vethari fleet stayed in orbit for another week after the bombardment ended, and they scanned the surface, and they saw the destruction, and the fires, and the ash clouds, and the radiation, and they were satisfied. And the fleet commander, whose name was Archon Seliuth, recorded a formal declaration, and broadcast it on all frequencies. The declaration said that the species known as humanity had been found guilty of unauthorized technological advancement, and that in accordance with the culling principle, the species had been weeded from the garden of civilization, and that the matter was now closed. And then the fleet left. They jumped to faster than light speed and vanished from the solar system, and they went back to their empire and filed their reports and moved on to other business, because to the Vethari this was routine, and they had done it before to other species, and they would do it again, and humanity was just another line in a ledger. But the Vethari had made a mistake. They had assumed that Earth was all that mattered, and they had not bothered to properly target the colonies on Mars and Titan and Europa, and they had not found the submarine cities deep beneath the oceans, and they had not discovered the bunker networks that governments had built deep underground, and they had not accounted for the sheer, stubborn refusal of human beings to simply lay down and die. Nearly 3 billion humans survived. They were scattered and wounded and grieving, and many of them were trapped underground or in sealed habitats with limited supplies, and the radiation on Earth's surface was terrible, and the infrastructure was destroyed, and there was no communication between the survivor groups for weeks, and everyone thought they were the last ones alive. But slowly and painfully, the survivors began to find each other. Radio signals flickered to life from deep bunkers, and submarine captains surfaced their boats in waters choked with ash, and Mars colony transmitted a desperate message asking if anyone on Earth could hear them. And one by one, the fragments of humanity began to reconnect like broken bones, slowly knitting back together. In a shattered military bunker buried deep beneath the Himalayas, a woman named Admiral Rhea Vasquez sat in a room lit by emergency power, and she was bleeding from a gash on her forehead, and her uniform was torn and covered in dust, and she had not slept in 4 days, and she had lost her entire family in the bombardment of Buenos Aires. Someone handed her a tablet that contained the Vethari Declaration, and she played it for the surviving members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were gathered in that broken room, and the alien voice spoke calmly about weeding humanity from the garden, and when it finished the room was silent. One of the generals asked what they should do now, and another said they should focus on survival, and another said they should try to make contact with the aliens and negotiate, and the room filled with quiet, desperate voices talking about rescue and recovery and rebuilding. Vasquez listened to all of them, and then she played the declaration again, and when it finished, she looked around the room at the faces of the men and women who were all that remained of Earth's military leadership. "They think they have killed us," she said, and her voice was calm and steady and cold as iron. "Good," she said. "Let them think that." And in that moment, in that broken room under a mountain on a world that was still burning, something changed, and it was not a plan yet, and it was not a strategy, and it was not even hope, because hope was too gentle a word for what filled that room. It was something older and darker and more powerful than hope. It was the promise that what had been done to Earth would not go unanswered, and that the beings who had burned humanity's world would one day learn the cost of leaving survivors. The sky above the Himalayas was black with ash, and the stars were hidden, and the world was dying. But beneath the surface, humanity was already beginning to sharpen its teeth. 15 years passed, and the galaxy forgot about humanity. The Vethari filed their report and closed the case, and the other species of the hegemony noted the destruction of yet another primitive civilization, and shrugged and moved on, because this was the way things had always been, and the culling principle had been applied hundreds of times before, and no species had ever come back from it. But beneath the dead surface of Earth, and inside the hollowed mountains of Mars, and in secret stations carved into asteroids drifting through the belt, something was happening that the galaxy could not see. Humanity was not recovering. Humanity was transforming. The first 5 years after the bombardment were the hardest, and they were years of starvation and radiation sickness, and despair and suicide. And there were moments when it seemed like the survivors would simply fade away and die in their bunkers and tunnels like animals hiding from a fire that had already passed. But they did not die. Admiral Rhea Vasquez understood something that the Vethari never could, and it was this: human beings do not become weaker when you hurt them, and they do not become smaller when you break them, and if you take everything from them, they do not collapse into nothing, but instead they become something harder and sharper and more dangerous than anything they were before. Vasquez unified the scattered survivor groups through sheer force of will, and she sent messages through underground cables and submarine relays, and eventually through repaired satellite links. And she connected Earth's bunkers with the Mars colonies and the Titan outposts and the Europa settlements, and she told them all the same thing. We are not rebuilding what we lost because what we lost is gone forever, and we are building something new, and what we are building is a weapon, and that weapon is all of us. She called it the Forge Doctrine, and it became the guiding principle of human civilization for the next decade, and the doctrine was simple. Every human being was a soldier, and every factory was a weapons plant, and every scientist was working toward one goal, and every child born after the bombardment was raised with the knowledge of what had been done, and the promise that it would be answered. The children of the bombardment grew up underground in bunkers lit by artificial light, and they never saw blue skies or felt rain on their faces, and their classrooms had walls covered with photographs of the cities that had been destroyed, and their teachers made them memorize the death toll of every continent. And they learned mathematics and physics and engineering, not because these subjects were interesting, but because these subjects would help them build the ships and weapons they needed to reach the stars and find beings who had murdered their world. One of these children was a boy named Jian Liang Maro, who had been 6 years old when the bombardment hit, and he had been in a school in Singapore when the orbital strikes began, and his parents had pushed him into a shelter beneath the school, and they had gone back to help other children, and the shelter door had closed, and the world above had turned to fire, and he never saw his parents again. Morrow grew up in the bunker networks of Southeast Asia, and he was quiet and serious, and he never smiled, and he studied harder than anyone else. And by the time he was 16, he was already training for combat, and by the time he was 20, he was one of the youngest officers in the new human military, and he carried a photograph of his parents in his chest pocket, and he looked at it every night before he slept. While the soldiers trained, the scientists worked. The bombardment had destroyed most of humanity's cities, but it had also left behind something valuable, and that was wreckage from Vethari scout ships that had been shot down during the attack because Earth's defense systems had managed to destroy a handful of the smaller alien vessels before being overwhelmed, and those crashed ships contained technology that was centuries ahead of anything humans had ever built. A physicist named Kofi Asant, who worked in a laboratory carved into the rock beneath the surface of Titan, spent 7 years studying the wreckage of a Vethari jump drive and trying to understand how it worked, and the mathematics were alien and strange, and there were moments when he thought he would never crack it, and he would sit alone in his lab staring at equations that made no sense and wondering if humanity was simply too primitive to understand what the Vethari had built. But then one night at 3 in the morning, after drinking his 4th cup of coffee, he saw it, and the pieces fell into place, and he understood not just how the Vethari drive worked, but why it was inefficient, and he saw a way to make it better, and he laughed out loud in his empty lab, because the Vethari had been using faster-than-light travel for thousands of years, and they had never figured out what a sleep-deprived human physicist had just figured out in 7 years. Asant's improved drive was twice as fast as the Vethari version and more fuel-efficient and harder to detect, and when he transmitted his findings to Vasquez on series, she read the report 3 times, and then she authorized the project that would change everything. Project Prometheus. It was the most ambitious construction program in human history, and it was built in total secrecy inside hollowed-out asteroids in the belt where no one would ever think to look, and the shipyards worked around the clock, with 3 shifts of workers building warships from stolen alien technology and human ingenuity and pure burning ray. They built over 800 ships in 10 years. The ships were not beautiful, and they were not elegant, and they looked nothing like the sleek curved vessels of the Vethari fleet, and instead they were angular and brutal and covered in heavy armor plating and bristling with weapons, and they looked exactly like what they were, which was machines built for one purpose, and that purpose was war. But ships alone were not enough, and Vasquez knew that human soldiers would be fighting against species that were stronger and faster, and had been waging war for millennia. And so, she authorized programs that would have been unthinkable before the bombardment. Genetic enhancement made human soldiers stronger and faster, and able to survive injuries that would have killed an unmodified human, and cybernetic implants connected their nervous systems to their weapons, and armor and combat AI systems were wired directly into their brains, giving them reaction times that no organic being could match. The humans who emerged from these programs were still human, but they were human in the way that a wolf is still a dog, and they were something fiercer and more dangerous than anything that had walked on Earth before it burned. And through all of this, humanity maintained absolute silence. No radio transmissions leaked into space, and no ships left the solar system, and no signals of any kind revealed that the human race was still alive, and to the galaxy Earth was a dead world orbiting a quiet star, and the Vethari checked their sensors occasionally, and saw nothing and nodded and moved on. 15 years after the bombardment, on a Tuesday morning just like the morning the Vethari had first appeared, Admiral Vasquez stood in the command center on Ceres and watched as a single stealth corvette activated its jump drive and blinked out of existence. It was the first human ship to leave the solar system. 12 hours later it returned. The pilot was a young woman named Lieutenant Sarah Chen, and her hands were shaking when she stepped off the ship, but her eyes were bright and fierce, and she carried with her star charts and intercepted hegemony communications and detailed scans of the nearest Vethari colony world, and she handed all of it to Vasquez and saluted. Vasquez reviewed the data for 3 hours, and then she called her senior commanders together, and she stood before them, and she looked at the star charts spread across the table, and she thought about Buenos Aires and her family, and the 4.2 billion dead, and the children who had grown up underground, and the 15 years of silence and patience and preparation. Operation Longbow is authorized, she said. And across the solar system, in shipyards hidden inside asteroids, 800 warships began powering up their engines and loading their weapons, and the crews strapped in and checked their systems, and looked at each other with hard, steady eyes. The galaxy had forgotten about humanity. It was about to remember. The first target was not the Vethari homeworld, and it was not a major military installation, and it was a supply depot on a small, dusty world called Selukar 7 on the outer edge of hegemony space, where alien freighters came and went carrying food and fuel and weapons to the border garrisons. The Vethari garrison on Selukar 7 consisted of 200 soldiers and a dozen patrol ships, and they were bored and complacent, because nothing ever happened on the frontier, and the last real threat to the hegemony had been crushed centuries ago. And the soldiers spent their days running routine drills and complaining about the food and counting the days until their rotation ended. They had no idea what was coming. The human fleet did not arrive all at once because Vasquez was not interested in a fair fight, and she was not interested in honor, and she was not interested in anything except winning. And so the attack on Selukar 7 began not with warships but with silence. Stealth drones slipped into the system days before the main fleet, and they mapped every defense platform and every patrol route and every communication relay, and they identified the garrison's command center and its power generators and its shield projectors, and they sent all of this information back to the fleet in tight encrypted bursts that were impossible to detect. And then on a quiet morning, when the garrison commander was eating breakfast, the sky above Selukar 7 split open, and 200 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above the planet, and they opened fire before the Vethari even understood what was happening. The battle lasted 40 minutes. The Vethari patrol ships were destroyed in the first 90 seconds, and the defense platforms lasted slightly longer, but not by much, and the garrison's shields held for about 10 minutes before human singularity missiles punched through them, and the ground assault began before the shields had even fully collapsed. Captain Jian Liang Moro led the first wave of soldiers onto the surface, and they came down in drop pods that hit the ground like iron fists, and the pods split open, and the soldiers inside came out fighting, and they were fast and precise, and utterly without mercy. The Vethari soldiers fought back, and they were well trained and well equipped, but they had never faced anything like this, because human soldiers did not fight the way any other species in the galaxy fought, and the Vethari could not understand what they were seeing. When a Vethari soldier was injured, it would fall back and seek medical attention, because that was the logical thing to do, and when a human soldier was injured, it kept fighting, and when a human soldier was badly injured, it fought harder, and when a human soldier was dying, it used its last moments to take as many enemies with it as possible. And this was not logical, and this was not sane, and the Vethari had no protocol for dealing with an enemy that simply refused to stop. One human soldier took a plasma bolt through the shoulder that burned away most of the muscle and bone, and she did not scream, and she did not fall, and she switched her rifle to her other hand, and killed 3 more Vethari guards before a medic reached her, and the security camera footage of this moment was later transmitted across the hegemony, and it terrified every species that saw it. The garrison fell, and the supply depot was captured, and the human soldiers stood among the wreckage, and they did not celebrate because this was not a victory, and this was a down payment on a debt that could never fully be repaid. But Selukar 7 was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, humanity struck 3 more outposts in rapid succession, and each attack was faster and more devastating than the last, and the hegemony was slow to respond, because their bureaucracy was enormous and ancient, and the reports coming in from the frontier made no sense to the officials reading them. A dead species was attacking the hegemony. That was impossible. The Vethari Council convened an emergency session, and Archon Celiath herself reviewed the reports and watched the combat footage, and she felt a cold sensation spreading through her body that she had not felt in 300 years of military service, and she realized with growing horror that the species she had personally ordered destroyed was not only alive, but had somehow become more dangerous than anything the hegemony had ever faced. While the hegemony debated and argued, and tried to understand what was happening, the humans were already moving to the next phase of their plan. On a world called Draven 4 deep inside hegemony territory, there was a labor camp where a species called the Dravni had been enslaved for over 2,000 years, and the Dravni were small and gentle, and they had been conquered so long ago that most of them had forgotten what freedom felt like, and they worked in mines and factories, and they were beaten and starved, and their children were taken from them and put to work as soon as they could walk. A human strike force hit Draven 4 without warning, and they destroyed the Vethari guards, and they broke open the labor camps, and the Dravni prisoners stood blinking in the light, not understanding what was happening, because no one had ever come to free them before, and no one had ever fought for them before. A human officer stood before a crowd of freed Dravni slaves, and she spoke through a translator, and she said that humanity had come from a world called Earth that the hegemony had tried to destroy, and that they were fighting back, and that the Dravni had a choice, and they could join humanity in this fight, or they could go their own way, and either choice was fine, because humanity did not force anyone to do anything. The Dravni elder who listened to this speech was very old and very tired, and he had spent his entire life in chains, and he looked at the human officer with her scars and her weapons and her hard, steady eyes, and he asked her one question. Why did you come here when you could have just attacked the Vethari directly? And the officer said, because we know what it feels like to have your world taken from you, and we would not leave you in chains while we had the power to break them. The Dravni joined the fight. So did the Osk, who were freed from labor worlds in the following weeks, and so did the Tanari and the Vesh and the Pelori. And one by one, the enslaved and oppressed species of the hegemony rose up and joined humanity, and the alliance grew with every world that was liberated. They called themselves the Pact of Ashes, and the name was chosen by a Dravni poet who said that from the ashes of Earth, a fire had been born that would burn the chains off every enslaved world in the galaxy. The hegemony had ruled through fear for 40,000 years, and no one had ever challenged them because no one had ever believed that the hegemony could be beaten. And the culling principle had ensured that any species strong enough to fight was destroyed before it got the chance. But humanity had survived the culling, and humanity had come back, and humanity was proving that the hegemony could bleed. And once the other species saw that the hegemony could bleed, they stopped being afraid. Archon Selioth stood in her command center watching the strategic display as system after system turned red, and she watched the alliance grow, and she watched her empire begin to crack, and she replayed the footage of that human soldier taking a plasma bolt and smiling at the camera, and she understood now what she had done 15 years ago when she had ordered the bombardment of Earth. She had not destroyed a threat. She had created one. And somewhere in the fleet moving through hegemony space, Admiral Vasquez received reports of the growing alliance, and she allowed herself a small moment of grim satisfaction, because the plan was working, and the hegemony was being attacked from the outside by human warships, and from the inside by its own enslaved populations, and the empire that had stood for 40,000 years was beginning to shake. But Vasquez was not foolish enough to think this would be easy because the hegemony was vast and powerful, and it had not yet committed its full military strength, and when it did, the real war would begin. She looked at the star charts, and she looked at the reports of human casualties that were already numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and she thought about the cost of what they were doing and whether the price would be worth it. And then she looked at the photograph on her desk, which showed the skyline of Buenos Aires on a sunny day with children playing in a park, and she put the photograph away and turned back to the war. The price would be worth it. It had to be. The hegemony finally woke up. For months, the Vethari Council had debated and argued and pointed fingers at each other, and some of them had insisted that the reports from the frontier were exaggerated, and some had claimed that the human attacks were merely the desperate actions of a dying species, and some had said that a simple punitive fleet would solve the problem. Archon Selioth knew better, but she had been overruled by politicians who had never fought a war, and had never seen blood, and who believed that the hegemony was invincible because it had always been invincible. But when the Pact of Ashes liberated its 20th world, and when 3 more hegemony supply lines were cut, and when the enslaved species began revolting on worlds that humans had never even visited, the Council finally stopped arguing and gave Selioth what she had been asking for: full military mobilization. For the first time in over 2,000 years, the hegemony activated its entire war machine, and warships that had been sitting in reserve fleets for centuries were pulled out of storage, and crews were conscripted from every member species, and weapons factories that had been running at half capacity began working day and night, and the full terrible weight of an empire that spanned thousands of star systems began to move. And the war that followed was the largest and most brutal conflict the galaxy had ever known. The first major clash came at Hegemony Relay Station Omega, which was the primary faster-than-light communication hub for the entire northern sector of hegemony space, and whoever controlled that station controlled the flow of information across 1,000 star systems, and Vasquez wanted it badly. Captain Morrow volunteered to lead the assault. And Vasquez looked at him for a long time before she agreed, because Morrow was one of her best officers, and she could not afford to lose him. But she also knew that he was the right person for this mission, because Morrow had a quality that was rare even among humans, and that quality was an absolute inability to give up. The attack on Relay Station Omega was a nightmare. The station was heavily defended, and the Vethari knew it was a likely target, and they had reinforced it with warships and defense platforms and ground troops, and the battle to reach the station cost the humans 11 ships and over 2,000 lives before Morrow's boarding parties even made it through the outer hull. Morrow led the boarding action personally, and he fought through corridors filled with smoke and blood, and the sound of weapons fire, and he lost soldiers with every room they took, and the Vethari defenders fought hard because they understood the importance of what they were protecting, and the fighting was hand-to-hand in some sections with humans and Vethari killing each other at arm's length. It took 6 hours to capture the station, and then the counterattacks began. The hegemony sent wave after wave of ships to retake Relay Station Omega, and Morrow held the station for 11 days and 11 nights, and he slept in 90-minute intervals on the floor of the command center with his rifle across his chest. And every time the alarms sounded, he was on his feet in seconds directing the defense and rallying his exhausted soldiers. On the 8th day, a Vethari boarding party breached the station's lower levels, and Morrow personally led the counterattack that drove them back, and he took a piece of shrapnel in his leg, and he pulled it out himself and kept fighting, and the soldiers who fought beside him began calling him the Unbreakable, and the name spread through the pact of ashes like wildfire. On the 11th day, relief forces arrived, and the hegemony fleet withdrew, and Morrow stood on the command deck of the station he had held, and he looked out at the wreckage of ships floating in space, and he did not feel triumph or relief or pride, and he felt only the weight of the names of every soldier he had lost, and he added those names to the list he carried in his head, alongside the name of every person he had ever failed to save, starting with his parents in Singapore. The capture of Relay Station Omega blinded the hegemony's northern fleet and threw their coordination into chaos, and it was the first major strategic victory of the war, but it would not be the last. 3 months later came the Battle of the Crimson Nebula. The hegemony had assembled its largest fleet in centuries, and 2,000 warships moved toward the Pact of Ashes forward operating base in the nebula, and the fleet was commanded by Selioth herself, because the Archon was done trusting subordinates, and she intended to crush the human threat once and for all. Vasquez had 600 human ships and 400 allied vessels from the Dravni and Osk and Tanari fleets, and she was outnumbered 2 to 1, and her officers looked at the sensor readings, and some of them went pale. But Vasquez had something the hegemony did not expect. For the past year, human scientists had been working on a weapon that was so dangerous that even Vasquez had hesitated before authorizing its development, and it was called the Singularity Torpedo, and what it did was create a microscopic black hole that lasted for approximately 4 seconds before evaporating, and 4 seconds does not sound like a long time, but when a black hole appears in the middle of a fleet formation, 4 seconds is an eternity. The Battle of the Crimson Nebula began with the hegemony fleet advancing in perfect formation, and the Vethari were magnificent in their discipline, and their ships moved like a single organism, and their weapons fired in coordinated volleys that lit up the nebula like a second sun. And then the Singularity torpedoes hit. The first torpedo detonated in the center of the hegemony's forward formation, and for 4 seconds, a point of absolute darkness appeared in space, and everything within 3 kilometers was pulled toward it, and warships that weighed millions of tons were dragged out of formation and crushed and torn apart, and the ships around them were thrown into chaos as the gravitational wave disrupted their systems. 12 more torpedoes followed in rapid succession, and the hegemony's perfect formation dissolved into a swirling mass of wreckage and confusion, and Vasquez ordered her fleet forward into the gaps, and the human and allied ships poured through the broken lines like wolves through a shattered fence. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, the hegemony had lost more than 1,000 ships, and Selioth retreated with what remained of her fleet, and for the first time in her long life, the Archon had been defeated. But the most important event of the war did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in a quiet room on a neutral space station, where a delegation from the Kelani species met secretly with human diplomats, And the Kelani were one of the 12 founding members of the hegemony, and they had been part of the coalition for 30,000 years, and they were tired. Tired of the culling principle and tired of the endless wars and tired of watching species be enslaved and destroyed. And they had seen what the humans were doing, and they had seen the Pact of Ashes growing, and they had watched the Battle of the Crimson Nebula, and they had made a decision. The Kelani defected. They withdrew from the hegemony and declared neutrality, and they opened their borders to Pact of Ashes refugees, and they shared intelligence about hegemony fleet movements and defensive positions, and the effect on the hegemony was devastating. Because if one founding species could leave, then any of them could, and the trust that had held the coalition together for millennia cracked like glass. The war raged on, and humanity paid a terrible price for every light year it gained, and colony ships were destroyed, and outposts were overrun, and millions of human and allied soldiers died in battles across 1,000 star systems, and the war-orphaned generation lost friends and lovers and comrades, and some of them began to wonder if there would be anyone left alive to see the end of it. And within the human command structure, a division was growing. There were those who believed the goal should be to dismantle the hegemony and free the enslaved species, and establish a new order based on cooperation and mutual defense. And then there were those who wanted something else, and what they wanted was the complete and total destruction of the Vethari species. An eye for an eye and a world for a world. They pointed to Project Sunbreaker, which was a weapons system capable of destabilizing a star and causing it to go supernova, and they said that it should be aimed at the Vethari home system, and they said that 4.2 billion humans had died, and that the Vethari should pay the same price. Admiral Vasquez listened to these arguments, and she understood them because she had lost her family and her city and her world, and there was a part of her that wanted nothing more than to watch the Vethari homeworld burn the way Earth had burned. But she also knew that if she gave that order, then everything humanity had fought for would mean nothing, and they would not be liberators or warriors or survivors, but simply another species that had learned to commit genocide, and the galaxy would look at them and see not heroes but monsters. She made her decision alone in her quarters on Ceres with the lights dimmed and the photograph of Buenos Aires on her desk, and she sat there for a long time thinking about the dead and the living and the future. Then she stood before the combined fleet and she spoke. "We are not going to become them," she said. "We will break their empire and we will free their slaves and we will make them answer for what they did, but we will not murder a world because that is what separates us from the monsters who burned ours." Some of her officers agreed and some did not, and Morrow stood in the back of the room, watching with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. And when the briefing ended, he walked up to Vasquez, and he looked at her with those hard, quiet eyes. "I lost everything on Earth," he said, "and I have spent my entire life wanting to make them pay." He paused. "But you are right, and if we burn their world, then my parents died for nothing." Vasquez put her hand on his shoulder and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and they stood together in silence, and then they went back to work because the war was not over yet. The final campaign was about to begin. Operation Requiem began on the anniversary of the bombardment of Earth, and this was not a coincidence because Vasquez wanted the Vethari to understand the significance, and she wanted every human soul dear in the fleet to carry the memory of that day with them, as they made the final push into the heart of the empire that had tried to erase them from existence. The assault was coordinated across 7 fronts simultaneously, and human fleets and allied forces from the Pact of Ashes struck at the Vethari core worlds from every direction, and it was the most complex military operation in the history of any species, and it required perfect timing and absolute commitment, and the willingness to accept losses that would have broken any other civilization. 300,000 soldiers died in the first week alone. The Vethari fought with the desperation of a species that understood it was fighting for its survival, and their ships threw themselves at the human formations, with a ferocity that surprised even Vasquez, and the core worlds were fortified with defenses that had been built over millennia, and every system had to be taken by force at tremendous cost. But humanity did not stop, and it did not slow down, and it did not waver. World after world fell to the pact of ashes, and the hegemony crumbled from the outside in like a building whose foundations had been eaten away. And the member species that had not already defected began surrendering or simply walking away from the coalition, and the great empire that had ruled the stars for 40,000 years was collapsing in a matter of months. Vasquez deployed Project Sunbreaker, but she did not aim it at the Vethari homeworld. Instead, she targeted the massive orbital defense network that surrounded the Vethari home system, and the weapon discharged a focused energy pulse that cascaded through the network's power grid, and every defense platform and weapons, satellite and shield generator in orbit around the Vethari world went dark simultaneously, and the planet lay exposed and defenseless beneath a sky full of human warships. And the humans did not fire. The population below looked up at the fleet that filled their sky, and they waited for the bombardment to begin, and they waited for the fire to fall, and mothers held their children and soldiers gripped their weapons, and the entire world held its breath. But the fire did not come. Instead, a message was broadcast on every frequency in every language, and it was Admiral Vasquez's voice, and she said simply, "We are not you, and this is over, and your leaders will answer for what they have done, but your world will not burn today." And on the surface of the Vethari homeworld, there was confusion and fear, and some anger and some relief, and in the great council chamber of the hegemony, the remaining leaders sat in silence as the reality of their defeat settled over them like dust. The ground assault on the Vethari capital was led by Captain Morrow, and his soldiers moved through the streets of the alien city, and the civilians watched from behind windows and doorways, and Morrow ordered his troops to hold fire unless fired upon, and they were fired upon several times by die-hard Vethari soldiers, but each engagement was brief and contained, and the human soldiers showed a discipline that stunned the Vethari who had expected savagery and found professionalism instead. Morrow walked into the great council chamber with a squad of soldiers at his back, and the room was enormous and ancient, and filled with symbols of conquest and power. And at the far end of the room, Archon Selioth sat in her command chair, and she was very old now, and her skin was gray, and her eyes were tired, but she sat straight and proud, and she did not flinch when the human soldiers entered. The other council members had fled or surrendered, but Selioth had remained because she was a warrior, and warriors do not run. Morrow walked the length of the chamber alone, and his boots echoed on the stone floor, and he stopped in front of Selioth, and they looked at each other, and neither spoke for a long moment. Then Selioth asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the war began. "Why," she said, "you had the power to destroy us and you chose not to, and I would not have made the same choice, and I want to understand why." Morrow looked at her, and he thought about his parents and about Singapore and about the bunker where he had grown up and about every friend he had buried and every nightmare he had endured and about the photograph in his chest pocket that he had carried through every battle. "Because someone has to remember what you did," he said, "and you cannot remember if you are dead." Selioth was silent for a long time, and then she stood, and she removed the symbol of her rank from her chest, and she placed it on the table between them, and it was a gesture of surrender. And it was the first time in the history of the hegemony that an Archon had surrendered to anyone. The war was over. What came next was harder than the fighting. The Vethari hegemony was formally dissolved in a ceremony attended by representatives of every species in the galaxy, and the 12-member species were given their independence, and the enslaved species were freed and reparations were established, and it was messy and complicated and imperfect because peace always is. Humanity established the Terran conquered, and it was not an empire, and it was not a hegemony, and it was a voluntary alliance open to any species that wanted to join, and the only rule was simple. Never again would one species be allowed to dominate or destroy another, and any member of the conquered could leave at any time because humanity understood that an alliance held together by force was not an alliance but a prison. War crimes tribunals were held, and Vethari military leaders were tried in courts with judges drawn from every species in the Pact of Ashes, and the trials were fair and thorough, and the guilty were sentenced to imprisonment, not execution, because Vasquez had insisted on this, and she had said that justice and vengeance are not the same thing, and that humanity would choose justice even when vengeance would feel better. Earth was declared a memorial world. The scars of the bombardment were preserved, and the craters where cities had stood were left untouched, and monuments were built bearing the names of the 4.2 billion who had died. And the planet became a place of pilgrimage for species from across the galaxy who came to see the world that had burned and to stand in the ruins, and to understand what the culling principle had truly meant. But Earth was not left as a grave. Around the ruins and between the craters life was returning, and grass was growing through the irradiated soil, and trees were being planted, and rivers were beginning to run clear again, and humans were building settlements on the surface for the first time in decades, and children were playing outside under open skies, and the sound of their laughter echoed across the plains where cities had once stood. Admiral Rhea Vasquez retired from military service on the day the conquered was formally established, and she refused every honor and every title that was offered to her, and she returned to Earth, and she built a small house near the ruins of Buenos Aires, and she planted a garden in soil that had been poisoned by orbital fire, and she tended that garden every day with patient, careful hands. She did not give interviews, and she did not write memoirs, and she did not appear at ceremonies, and when people asked about her, they were told that she was at home working in her garden, and that she preferred to be left alone. She had nightmares every night for the rest of her life, but she slept in a bed on the surface of the world she had saved, and she could feel the wind on her face and hear the birds that were slowly returning to the skis above Buenos Aires, and that was enough. Captain Morrow became Ambassador Morrow, and he was the first human representative to the galactic community, and he traveled to worlds he had once attacked, and he sat across tables from species that had once been enemies, and he shook hands and signed treaties, and built relationships that would have seemed impossible just years before. He was hard and scarred, and he did not smile easily, but when he shook hands he meant it, and the aliens who met him could see in his eyes both the war and the peace that followed, and they trusted him, because they could see that he had earned the right to speak of both. He still carried the photograph of his parents in his chest pocket, and sometimes late at night in his quarters on whatever station or world he happened to be visiting, he would take it out and look at it, and he would tell them quietly about the things that had happened and the world that was being built, and he would promise them that it had been worth it. On a liberated colony world far from Earth, a Dravni child approached a human relief worker who was helping to distribute food and supplies, and the child was small and had wide, curious eyes, and she tugged on the worker's sleeve and asked a question. What was Earth like before the bee? Odd things happened. The worker paused, and she looked down at the child, and then she looked up at the sky, which was full of unfamiliar stars that she was still learning the names of, and she thought about blue oceans and green forests and cities full of music, and the way the sun looked setting over the Pacific, and the way rain smelled in the summer. It was beautiful, she said. And then she smiled. And it will be again. Across the galaxy, the species that had once whispered about humanity as a cautionary tale, and as the primitives who had been culled by the hegemony now spoke of them differently, and the word they used most often was not fearsome, although the fear was certainly there, and the word was not powerful, although the power was undeniable. The word was respect. Because the Vethari had targeted Earth thinking they were pulling a weed from the garden of civilization, and they had burned that world and killed billions, and walked away satisfied that the job was done. But they had not pulled a weed. They had planted a seed. And from the ashes of one burning world, a forest had grown that stretched across the stars and sheltered every species that had ever been told. It was too small or too weak or too primitive to matter. And the forest was still growing, and it would keep growing long after the last scar on Earth had been covered by green. Humanity had been targeted, and it had survived, and it had fought back, and it had won, and it had chosen mercy when it could have chosen destruction. And that choice, more than any weapon or warship or battle, was the reason the galaxy would never forget them. The stars were no longer silent, and humanity was no longer looking up with wonder. It was looking out with purpose.